January returns people to the business of endurance. Snow that sparkled in the company of bells looks like work when it reappears on a weekday morning. Houses shed their ornament with the reluctant dignity of elders taking off party shoes. The street is still a street, and the sidewalks still accept the scuffs that testify to ordinary life. The difference is not in the surface. It is in the stored image of what the surface did when asked politely to be generous for 60 minutes. A year lengthens and contracts according to private almanacs. In mine, a new entry has been added beside the notation for the first hard frost and the date the taxes go to the preparer. It simply reads illumination hour, and in that phrase sits a completeness most reforms never achieve. The neighborhood did not overthrow rules or mock those who believe in them. It did not abandon standards or mistake volume for vitality. It taught a book to read itself in the light it had tried to meter too tightly. That is a curriculum worth repeating. There is a temptation in stories like this to elevate villains and install martyrs. That sells, but it does not last. The Karen archetype depends on readership that is both gleeful and self-forgiving. I am less interested in that popularity seminar and more interested in craft, when people who share fences also share the labor of timing and courtesy. The politics of grievance lose their glamour. The woman who once loved to inventory violations is now merely someone who likes order, and a person who likes order can learn to admire elegance when elegance obeys schedules and protects sleep. The next December will arrive with its usual list. The plan will re-emerge from its magnet on the fridge. Children who grew an inch will stand more squarely in their boots. A newcomer will be handed the checklist without ceremony and will understand that citizenship here includes knowing where the cord covers are stored and how to tape a mat so no one trips. The food bank will send a note and not know where to address its gratitude. That is appropriate. The point is not to win credit, it is to keep the machine of consideration oiled. If someone asks for the moral, give them this one. In places where harmony is measured by inches, people can still measure themselves by the room they make for each other's joy. The tools are unglamorous: good timers, accurate maps, shared ladders, consent to end on time. The virtues are old and disarmingly uncinematic: patience, restraint, the willingness to learn policy and then bend it gently toward generosity without breaking it. The reward is neither viral fame nor a dramatic courtroom scene. The reward is waking up in January and knowing your street knows how to be a street that is not embarrassed to have felt beautiful in public. I stand occasionally on my lawn in the late afternoon, testing the angle of a winter sun that begins at a different point on its arc every day. The eaves do not carry light in those moments, but my eye superimposes the memory like a child's tracing paper. You can teach yourself to see a neighborhood in that layered way, as a set of present facts illuminated by a record of decent behavior. When I do that, I notice fewer hedges and more thresholds, fewer rules and more agreements. I think that is the point at which community ceases to be a word on a brochure and begins to act like something alive. The story ends where most good practices end, with a habit reliable enough to fade from announcement and strong enough to endure mishaps. Someone will forget a timer next year and the sky will not fall. Someone will overcut a silhouette and it will look endearingly wrong. The neighborhood will declare it charming by consensus. The HOA will file its amended policy and then get busy choosing paint codes for shutters. The hour will bloom and close, and nothing dramatic will follow except the slow accretion of trust, which is drama's opposite and arguably the better show for people weary of performance. This is a record, not a sermon. If it functions as instruction, use it and then forget where you got it. If it functions as an essay, argue with it in the best possible faith and then choose to be kind anyway. December will return, and when it does, ask your block to stand with you in the cold for 60 minutes and learn how to become visible without becoming loud. End on time, put away the cords, send your boxes to the food bank, teach your bylaws to admire you, then go inside and rest. The hour will hold. The next day behaved like any Sunday called upon to pretend it is ordinary. The frost recorded where boots and stroller wheels had been. The chalkboard wore due like a half-hearted erase or swipe. The food bank boxes had already relocated to shelves that would redistribute kindness without mentioning its source. In communities that measure time by meetings, the real work after a change is administrative. The HOA scheduled a policy review without acknowledging that it had been scheduled by an hour that had made review necessary. Governance has its own aesthetics, and minutes are their literature. In the next session, the board revisited seasonal illumination with verbs chosen for neutrality: clarify, align, affirm. The proposed amendment mapped precisely to the street's choreography. Window silhouettes were affirmed as permissible without prior approval. Timed communal displays within the stated holiday window received a presumption of compliance provided they observed safety and duration limits. Language that once leaned toward preemptive restriction adjusted its balance toward curated allowance. The The policy moved an inch in a direction that will matter for a decade. Attendance at the meeting exceeded the number of chairs the room had expected. People discover their civic appetite when they see that participation can steer tone rather than simply scold outcomes. The compliance chair did not resign in drama. The chair described a desire to rest and allow new hands to hold the pen. Two neighbors who had carried the shared clock and the cord covers stood for election and were affirmed. This is the quiet succession that prevents future hours from having to be engineered as if they were emergency procedures. The news segment ran in a montage of seasonal sentimentality, and for once the sentimental did not embarrass the subject. A local site published a short profile of neighborhood-led celebrations that prefer courtesy to spectacle. Emails arrived that read like recipe requests. The plan was distilled into a single sheet that fit on a fridge. Timing blocks, safety notes, wattage tips, a reminder about porch lights for exit. And a line item no HOA had considered codifying until a cul-de-sac taught them to. The line item recommended a donation box for whatever charity the block could agree upon in under 5 minutes. The 5-minute rule is there to remind adults that perfection is the enemy of participation. Inside my home, December resumed its statistical tasks. Lunches had to be prepared, and a school project about snowpack in mountain towns assembled with the earnestness that transforms cardboard into topography. The bins were relabeled for next year with the accurate pride of work done once and intended to be done again. The ladder returned to its wall rack with scuffs that read like a scrapbook entry. No one would have guessed that a policy change slept on the garage shelf. But policy changes often take their naps where tools live. Cultural memory forms in layers, and the neighborhood accumulated one. The hour became a thing people mentioned casually to visiting family members, the way a person mentions a favorite trail or a good diner. This is how traditions install themselves. They sneak inside the language of introduction and refuse to leave. Children redrew their own maps. And their maps included the quiet ceremony of flipping a switch that flips 100 other switches in homes that share no blood but believe they share something better than that, a commitment to being near other people respectfully. The HOA published the amended policy, and a handful of residents wrote the expected overcorrections. Some wanted the allowance expanded into spectacle. Others wanted it rescinded in favor of quiet as doctrine. The board, for once, occupied the median with grace. It held to the hour. It held to silhouettes. It trusted the residents to behave as they had behaved, and trust is a currency that buys more loyalty than enforcement can compel. The chapter concludes with a clipboard returned to a closet, a cord spool stored with the muscle memory that eliminates tangles, and a block that has forgotten how to be merely competent and learned how to be modestly proud. At 5:59, the cul-de-sac learned the power of the almost. The warm-up glow threaded itself along the block like a rumor confirmed in real time. It was the kind of light you use to check on a sleeping child without waking her, the kind that affirms without insisting. 1 minute later, the street ascended into the discipline of its own plan. 30-plus homes illuminated themselves within exactly the allowances they had been given. And allowances multiplied by neighbors ceased to behave like grudging permissions. They behaved like shared design. No single house congregated attention. That was the point. A chorus is the humane answer to a solo that committees have chosen to fear. The silhouettes performed better than anyone predicted, paper learning to impersonate stained glass by virtue of collective intention. Garlands framed doorways with a restraint that felt like manners. Low stakes along walks guided feet without claiming the lawn. Inside each home, timers kept faith with the schedule, and the hour ticked forward the way good ceremonies do, with no hero, no narrator visible, only a common willingness to stand in a safe cold and remember why seasons exist. Traffic adapted to the changed street without complaint because the street had not become a spectacle. A few cars idled at the entrance, then understood the tempo and moved on. A police cruiser conducted a drive-by glance and found no reason to linger. Teenagers pointed their phones with a tenderness they rarely admit. A child placed a can of soup into the food bank box, then looked for more to carry. The box filled, then required a second, and the chalkboard tally turned from a plan into a record, and a record into a modest pride. News found us because news is trained to smell novel arrangements of ordinary materials. A local reporter appeared, and the camera operator practiced a sidestep between a stroller and a dog leash with the grace earned by experience. No interview was needed. The hour spoke fluently without speech. The lens captured the discipline of the plan and asked viewers to decide whether this was a little miracle or a well-executed neighborhood memo. In a culture that loses itself to cynicism, small competence can read as wonder. The anchor later leaned on a phrase that will not be retired as long as December recurs. Brighter than TimesSquare, the voice would say, and although it was an exaggeration deployed in the service of ratings, the people on our street understood what it meant. It meant ordinary life had temporarily refused to apologize for wanting to be lovely. At 6:30, the dimming did the elegant work of endings. We do not train ourselves enough in this country to love endings. We pretend that constant availability is a kindness and annihilate attention in the process. The slow fade returned us to conversation tones and layered sweaters. The encore at 6:50 spared the latecomer's shame. Grace understands delay and forgives it without commentary. At 7 on the dot, the block performed its final act of civility and went dark. The dark felt different because it had been preceded by a light that obeyed both the letter of the law and the longing of the people who live under it. After the hour, inboxes performed their usual theatrics. A handful of messages applauded the neighborhood's creativity. A couple performed concern about precedent in tones that suggested they had perwritten the concern weeks ago. One traveled from 3 cul-de-sacs away to ask for a copy of the timing chart. This is the part of community that never gets its own headline. People borrow decency the way they borrow ladders. A plan is a tool, and good tools want to be shared. The HOA did what conscientious committees do when they meet a fait accompli engineered within boundaries. It fell silent. It adjusted its posture later in public. It kept its authority where authority belongs and ceded a little influence to the wiser force of confidence earned by the residents it is supposed to serve. The hour had not humiliated it, which matters, because humiliation breeds a counterproductive stubbornness. The hour had simply demonstrated that rulebooks written to prevent excess are not obligated to suffocate generosity. If this were an invented tale designed to flatter the storyteller, it would end with a decision delivered at a meeting that applauds itself. Real life accepts that cultural shifts announce themselves in afterglow rather than fireworks. The street, once again dark, felt more like a place and less like a corridor. People closed doors with the relief that follows a task done properly, and the anticipatory affection that begins the minute a tradition discovers it has a future. The chapter pauses there, cooled and satisfied, because a pause is what lets a lesson harden into foundation. The first evening without our roofline carried a fatigue disproportionate to the absence of a string of LEDs. A cul-de-sac gains character from its night face, and ours had surrendered its distinguishing mark. The same pavement received the same tires, the same porches framed the same doors. Meaning, however, had departed. And people feel that more sharply in December when days impose their early endings on minds already crowded with inventories of what hasn't happened yet and might not. The neighborhood looked competent, which is the adjective you give to spaces that have eliminated offense at the expense of invitation. A block without invitation becomes a corridor. People use it to get through, not to arrive. The tray exchange had reminded me that not everyone is content with corridors. Communities contract around their noticed losses and expand around their shared recoveries. The binder that had been about winning an argument became a workshop manual for a different design. The premise was simple enough to be missed by those who prefer the complicated answer. If one house cannot be permitted a generous display because committees fear escalation, then 30 modest displays obeying the same rule at the same time transform the fear into rhythm. The plan required avoiding the obvious traps. It could not be called a protest. It could not invite outsiders or perform for cameras. It could not disrespect ordinary traffic or require public resources. It could not test the HOA's jurisdiction. It had to inhabit it precisely, then reproduce it until intervention looked unneighborly. The phrase community hour seemed harmless enough to pass unnoticed and accurate enough to withstand scrutiny. Coordination lives or dies on the credibility of the coordinator. I do not raise my hand quickly, but I do not refuse responsibility when I am the one with the binder. I drew a street map on graph paper the way a child draws treasure routes, each square an equitable unit of responsibility. The guiding principle was multiplication of small permissions. Window silhouettes are almost always allowed because they live on the right side of the glass. Doorframe garlands are permitted as long as they honor their trim lines. Low garden stakes that do not cross walkways tend not to frighten enforcement. In the design studio of a block, these are the reliable materials. Timers form the metronome of civility. A single hour on a single Saturday, preceded by a soft warm-up and closed by an encore for latecomers, promised to deliver a shared event without burdening those who prize quiet. 5:59 to 6, a modest glow. 6 to 6:30, a steady performance. 6:30 to 7, a gentle dim. 7 to 7:10, a reprise for the stragglers. After that, an unambiguous return to regular programming. Anyone who has ever negotiated a truce knows the value of an end time stated in large, friendly numbers. Safety is the paragraph that turns critics into reluctant allies. A nurse on the block assembled a first aid kit. A utility worker provided temporary signs that asked drivers to consider their speed without presuming authority. Cord covers arrived in bulk from a warehouse that does not care whether it is supporting a holiday or a home improvement. The checklist added itself to the plan with the satisfaction of a puzzle piece snapping into place. Preparation has a sound, and it is the sound of tape pulled from a roll, plastic divided from a sheet, a staple pressed into wood with a steady hand that remembers shop class. Permissibility needed one more hinge, a quick review of city allowances. The municipality's view of seasonal displays was consistent with reason. It recommended timers and courtesy and asked that walkways remain clear. It honored gatherings that did not demand road closures. It did not attempt to write soul into policy, which is to its credit. Where the HOA's prose elevated sameness, the city's language pointed towards safety, which is the rightful domain of government. Securing those lines would matter if conflict attempted to enlarge itself. Word traveled not by announcement, but by adjacency. A neighbor learned from a neighbor, then another. A half circle of houses around the cul-de-sac said yes faster than expected, and the next street over inquired whether edge participation would dilute or reinforce the design. Consensus prefers proximity, but it also respects invitation, and the map widened until it included enough houses to become a pattern rather than a set of exceptions. This is how power migrates from committees to citizens, politely on paper. With a highlighter, by the end of the week the street had learned its choreography. Window silhouettes were cut from sturdy paper and posed as bells, stars, trees, and a city skyline that nodded sweetly toward the larger world beyond our cul-de-sac. Doorframes carried garlands that minded their boundaries. A handful of mailboxes accepted a thin spiral of light that would not spook the rule keepers. The shared clock for the smart plugs rested on a shelf like a small oath. The HOA knew nothing until it knew everything, and knowing everything would not equip it to object without appearing to object to kindness. On the day chosen by the calendar, the weather cooperated in the way that matters most. It did not assert itself. The air held its cold without producing wind. The sky performed its quick winter dusk. The neighborhood dressed in hats and kept its mugs in its own hands, because litter violates principles as efficiently as it violates lawns. I stood on my porch with the calm of someone who has seen plans either fail small or succeed larger than anyone predicted, and is prepared to accept both as information. 1 hour would settle the argument about whether a rulebook can coexist with a little grace. The chapter stops there, 1 minute before the warm-up glow, not for drama's sake, but to honor the quiet that should always precede any light that intends to be generous. The weather changed in the way procedural weather changes, without wind, without thunder, just a drop in barometric pressure you feel behind the eyes. The second notice arrived with less ornament. It referenced nuisance in the abstract and attached screenshots pulled from a neighborhood forum where complaint's favorite costume is the voice of civic duty. The images were the kind produced by overexposed phones and undertrained operators. The kind that flatten night into glare and call it proof. The letter inherited their certainty, a lineage of pixels elevated to policy. The work of answering these things is both dull and essential. Dull because numbers and dates do not sparkle. Essential because numbers and dates are the only scaffolding strong enough to hold a structure of fairness. I composed a response in a tone that prioritized competence over heat. It listed lumens and foot candles measured at the property line and halfway to the curb. It itemized wattage per run and breaker load well below threshold. It mapped cord routes under matting and within shrub boundaries. It cited the city's published guidance aligning seasonal displays with residential safety, and it explained the controller's dimming profile as a function of respect rather than capitulation. It offered a meeting conducted in good faith before any sanction and proposed times when professionals on both sides could attend. The meeting occurred in a multipurpose room that had hosted far more bake sales than adjudications, but was nevertheless prepared to feel official. Framed photographs documented prior board achievements in the grammar of giant scissors cutting ceremonial ribbons. The agenda was printed on paper that curled in the humidity of earnestness. The board spoke in a registered plurality, the voice of collective responsibility manufactured by laminated nameplates and a shared look of relief that the script would be followed. The compliance chair described neighborhood cohesion as a kind of visual hush. I described compliance as the architecture of generosities given to each other within safety's fence. The minutes would later remark upon a willingness to compromise. Those words are sometimes the shorthand for capitulation. There is a moment in any bureaucracy's life when the comfort of precedent cannot absorb an exception without unraveling into policy panic. The next letter arrived as a schedule of fines. It expressed regret while performing escalation. It thanked me for my cooperation while assuming removal. The notice introduced an artificial countdown to a decision the committee preferred to call mutual. The black type against white paper did its work on the eye. Paper has always known how to mimic permanence. The question was no longer whether I had complied. The question had become whether I would agree not to test the paper's appetite for contradiction. A woman who has built her adult life by setting timers and keeping promises recognizes the difference between an argument about taste and an effort to codify control. I also recognize that winning battles in the wrong campaign is foolish. I climbed the ladder and unclipped the eave line. I coiled cords and labeled bins. I slid the paper stars into flat storage like fragile things rescued from an unsympathetic climate. There's a way to remove a display without surrendering intention. It requires storing the purpose in a larger box than the one that originally housed it. The street returned to its appointed color palette and the night resumed its official darkness. Absence rewrites a block's choreography as efficiently as presence. The stroller that had paused no longer did. The neighbor who had once lifted a hand now kept it in a pocket. The house looked as if it had never learned to glow indoors. The tree continued to perform its small alchemy of light and glass, and my daughter continued to chart the calendar with the patience of a child who understands that ritual often outlasts regulation. I felt the dull ache that follows a solved equation with an unsatisfying sum. Stories about homeowners and associations often value heat over light, which is ironic but unsurprising. It is tempting to turn every notice into a crusade and every board into a villain. Seasons, however, benefit from craft. The better question is not how to win against a committee, but how to author a place so that committees become audience instead of protagonists. The next sequence required a different kind of attention. It needed quiet recruitment and the patient multiplication of small, lawful graces. It needed an hour that would transform compliance from a private act into a communal choreography. Before that hour could be imagined, a small message arrived in metal. A tray appeared on my porch under a square of winter sun. Gingerbread cookies announced themselves with a confidence that paper never musters. No note, no signature, only a pattern of sugar that implied we were not alone. The next evening a return tray traveled in the other direction, peppermint bark wrapped in the understated diplomacy of waxed paper. This is how human policy begins, not with motions and seconds, but with trays exchanged under the truce of cold. A neighbor 2 doors down removed window candles not because of a letter, but because he had read the weather and decided to avoid headwinds. Another neighbor confessed a wreath had been questioned. Rumors polymerized into caution, and caution smoothed the street until it resembled a showroom. My binder sat on a shelf with its tidy spine, a tool now for a different aim. The next chapter would not be about whether a single house could hold a line. It would be about whether a block could teach its own rules to honor joy without calling it disorder. The chapter closes at the precise minute the timer once dimmed. Now dark by default, with an awareness that darkness can be drafted to make light visible again when the plan is sound. The neighborhood introduced itself the way master-planned communities always do, with a brochure smile and hedges trimmed to a measured semaphore that claimed harmony. The map arrived tucked into the closing documents like a polite directive, each cul-de-sac a soft curl at the end of a sentence about common purpose. At first glance, nothing here seemed capable of conflict. People waved from mailboxes the way people are taught to wave in places that talk about property values as if they were a family heirloom, and the sidewalks were the kind that pretend they have never met a skate wheel. The place had its own rhythm, but the melody belonged to the covenants, and the covenants were exhaustive. A woman in my position learns to read rules the way other people read weather. Predicting pressure changes becomes an instinct. And knowing when to carry an umbrella changes outcomes. The binder from the Homeowners Association was an inch thick and sincere about its own importance. It explained harmony by inches, lumens, decibels, pigments, and calendar windows. It drew a box around what counts as belonging. In a culture that has outsourced courtesy to policy, this is what passes for neighborliness. I turned pages, not as a supplicant, but as a practitioner. I teach myself places by learning the language they believe in. The document believed in deficits of difference and thresholds of brightness. The rule that mattered most sat in a paragraph that pretended to be generous. Seasonal illumination, it announced, would be welcomed between the first Friday after Thanksgiving and the first Sunday in January, provided timers ensured quiet after 9, wiring hid politely, and wattage remained ordinary. A handful of phrases did most of the work: nuisance, light trespass, visual clutter. The prose offered tradition and limited it in the same breath, a compromise dressed as a favor. It was enough to work with, and working within a system while reserving the right to critique it is a skill worth cultivating. Light has always been a practical poetry for me. In December, a slender strand of LEDs can turn a window into a promise. And a careful eave line can persuade a roof to imitate a horizon. My daughter counts winters by the spill of that glow, I count them by the small rituals that hold when other structures have shifted. A divorce reassigns loyalties to objects, and the work becomes arranging the world so a child's memory of home is defined by the safety of repetition rather than the geography of loss. In that calculus, a roofline becomes a thesis and a timer is a metronome for steadiness. I approach the house as an electrician approaches a panel, with order, labels, and a courtesy for limits. A pair of outdoor GFCI had been added in summer with the quiet finality of good work. The eaves were measured, clips counted and verified against wind. A single warm white run traced the fascia with the restraint of a whisper. The bay window received a wash calibrated to reveal a tree without sending a beacon across the street. Along the walk, low stakes established a rhythm for feet and a boundary for wiring. Paper stars, suspended on monofilament at interior height, learned to hover as if by consent. At 8 each evening, the controller softened everything by half. At 9, the house made itself dark again with a dependable humility. A first night like that tells you who your neighbors are, but not who they will be when committees take an interest. Strollers slowed with the natural curiosity of people who believe they have discovered a small event. Dogs performed the choreography of leash and approval. Curtains lifted and lowered as if auditioning for a role in a winter advertisement. It was not spectacle, it was measured invitation. A cul-de-sac can be a stage if a community allows generosity to be a sanctioned performance. The timer reduced the brightness at precisely 8, and the place exhaled in concert with the fading, a sign that concessions can be orchestrated without bitterness. I stood at the edge of my lawn and assessed the boundaries the way a cartographer evaluates a coastline. The light did not cross into bedrooms, and the cords did not trespass across paths. The city's guidance was more liberal than the HOA's chapter would admit, and I filed that fact in the folder where useful truths are stored until needed. Compliance, when done thoroughly, is both armor and argument. The neighborhood would be asked to decide which it respected more, the letter of the allowance or the spirit of a narrow sameness. On that first night, the question had not yet been asked. Morning in places like this is a sing-song of predictable engines and the measured clatter of bins rolled to curb lines. The house looked ordinary again by daylight, as if the night had been a rumor. People prefer their specialness confined to approved slots. For a time, everyone agreed that winter could be softened by art as long as the art knew when to be quiet. The surprise of an envelope brought the first correction. The seal bore the emblem of ordered concern. The letter's phrasing congratulated the community on its seasonal spirit, and then introduced a preliminary noncompliance characterized as a coordination issue between scope and neighborhood standards. A season always contains more than one season. There is the season of preparation, then the season of illumination, and then the season of interpretation. The last is the longest and the most brittle. A notice is not an argument, it is an invitation to pick a battleground. I stacked photographs, notes, measurements, and citations into a chronological spine and waited for the rest of the body to assemble. The chapter ends with that quiet discipline. The timer faithful to the minute, the house obedient to the schedule it had promised, and a binder acquiring weight, because evidence has its own gravity and gravity eventually insists on motion.